Hi, everybody. My name is Vilex. I am a developer for DevRev. So, before we jump right into speaking with Vinod, I wanted to show you all something. And let me preface it by saying this. Software development and engineering today is vastly different than it was 10 or even 5 years ago, and the pace of change is only picking up. There's very rarely a week that goes by without something new and slash or improved coming out of the tech community. For example, in recent years, some of the biggest advancements have been in the area of natural language processing. One of these advancements has been the development of GPT-3. GPT-3 is a language model developed by OpenAI that responds with natural language given a text prompt. While using AI for natural language processing is, not new at all, GPT-3 comes a long way from those early chatbots due to its huge amount of training data and expansive artificial neural network. In addition to holding a conversation, GPT-3 has many other functions, such as answering questions, responding to essay prompts, and writing code, which, is what we're most interested in. OpenAI has recently come out with Codex, which they call a descendant of GPT-3. Codex is able to take natural language commands and generate functioning code from those commands. Some of you may have seen OpenAI's Codex demo where they created a simple JavaScript game by giving Codex commands which showcased Codex's programming abilities. This is huge because it allows a developer to work more efficiently by focusing more on the problem and less on how to translate directions into code. OpenAI's demo was showcased on their own JavaScript sandbox, but developers wouldn't use their JavaScript sandbox to do their job. So I wanted to see if I could incorporate Codex into one of the most commonly used tools of developers, which is VS Code. So let's go to take a look right now. Alrighty, perfect. So um, I wanted to highlight two functionalities of Codex. The first one is generating code from natural language, and the second one is generating comments from code. So it goes both ways. Let's go ahead and get started. So right here, you can see that I have written a function down for, let's just go ahead and change it. Let's say I want to generate 15 random numbers instead. And then I want to sort these numbers in, let's do decreasing order starting off. Then I want to print those numbers and I want to repeat the whole thing 3 times. So let's see how Codex does. All I have to do is highlight it, right click, and hit natural language to code. That is the extension that I've written as an interface for the Codex, for OpenAI's Codex. And I can click it and fingers crossed, it'll give me something. Awesome. So it's given me code, and this is generated from Codex. And this is really fantastic because, obviously, like I started writing the comment in, or started writing the comment in language that you and I can understand. You don't have to be a developer to be able to know what's going on. However, all I had to do is right click it, and it generates language that the computer can understand. Now I can also, let's say I want to do increasing order instead of decreasing order. And let's see what it gives me this time. And here we go. So this got rid of the decreasing is true, and it's giving me increasing now. Now I can move on to the second demo, which will be comment generation. So let's say I've been given this function. Let's pretend that I did not write it and someone else has written it for me, or someone else has written it. And I, for whatever reason, maybe it's time, maybe I just don't want to, like, I don't have the resources to go in and understand this function line by line. So what I can actually do is highlight this function. Let's highlight the whole thing and see what happens. Highlight this function, right click, and let's hit explain code. And let's see what we get. So it tells us that, the first line of the function is a for loop that will run 5 times. Then it creates a variable called x1 and sets it equal to a random element from the list x. And then it does the same thing for y1 from the list y. And it outputs the value of x1 and y1. So the coolest thing about this is that you don't have to be a developer to, be able to understand what the code is doing. I will say there are a lot of flaws in this extension. However, for something that has taken me less than a couple hours to write, it's already pretty useful and it improves my workflow a lot as a developer. So now I will stop screen sharing. Now, awesome. So with that, I would like to welcome Vinod onto stage where where he will be joining me and we'll be talking about the future of tech. Hey Vinod, how are you?
It's great to be here.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here. I'm honored to be here with you. So why don't you start by introducing yourself for those that don't know you?
Oh boy, I've not introduced myself in forever. Anytime there's something weird or different to do, I find it fun to work on. We generally define what we do as bold, early, and impactful. The demo you gave, we sort of invested in 3 years ago when most people weren't talking about, when we invested in actually two companies, OpenAI as the largest venture investor in OpenAI, and in a small company then called Codota, now called Tab9. I don't know how many of the people use Tab9, but it's like a virtual AI pair programmer. And we can talk about that too. So, the way to introduce myself is if technology is going to cause a lot of disruption over time, then it's my business. It's what I love to do and love to work on. Let me start. I loved your demo. I think it's a great way to start.
Thank you.
But imagine I then added iteratively a series. I said, well, for special characters, for numerical characters, sort them last as my next comment. Or, what to do with special characters. You can start to see where this might go. And I'm excited by the fact that when Excel came on the scene, it basically created 100 million programmers, to use round numbers. Lots of people could program in Excel within limited domains and not know they were coding. Um, the demo you gave is the beginnings of that, and the best way to imagine where that leads, which is why I'm so excited about AI broadly, but especially in code development, is my first cell phone was 28 pounds, about the size of a sewing machine.
Wow.
Now, most people haven't seen a sewing machine. So I had to mount it on the passenger side of the car. eh,
Wow.
And the cord was about 10 times bigger than today's iPhone. But it took 7 generations or 8 generations of phones before we got to the iPhone. Um, in the way to think about the world, and these were physical phones, so it took 3 years to develop each cycle. It took 20 some years to go through 7 generations from a 28-pound sewing machine uh, to the iPhone. Software development happens much faster. You talk GPT-3, GPT-4 is well in process. I was just getting an update on that. Um, I think in 10 years, software development looks very, very different, driven by AI changes. Uh, Another analogy I want to give people is, just very recently, when we invested in GitLab, right, the term DevOps did not exist. And that wasn't very long ago. Sid was essentially a small developer out of YC when we invested in him with a 10 or 12 million post money valuation. Um, and now it's a $15 billion company in a relatively short time, and the world is about DevOps. So use that to imagine what DevOps in 5, 7, 10 years, or programming in 5, 7, 10 years could be. Look at the OpenAI demos on Codex, and frankly, use Tab9. See what a pair programmer feels like. It'll auto-complete your code next, almost the way Google completes your search, because it can anticipate what you might want to do. Anyway, let me stop there. I could go on and on. Well, Alex, I can't hear you.
I'm so sorry. There was a fire truck going by. But it's great to see that you're so passionate about this subject. I am too, but I wanted to, take a little pivot into ethics. So I wanted to get started with a couple questions regarding ethics, which has been taking up more and more space in the tech industry in recent years. And, it's particularly relevant as of late with the whole Facebook whistleblower situation. So, given that AI and ML is progressing so quickly, do you think that certain people, such as support or even some healthcare professionals, will be out of jobs within the next few years?
I don't think that's true today. It might be true in 2050. Uh, I would guess for the next decade or so, the economist's paradigm of when you get a new productivity technology on the scene, it removes a bottleneck. And there's lots of demand for all the other technologies surrounding it. And that creates more jobs will be true.
Mhm,
Uh, but when I look past to 2050 or so, it's hard for me to imagine what humans can do that an AI won't be able to do, for sure. I'd assign a 90% probability to that scenario. It's never for sure means 90%. One can always be wrong. Um, so I think for the next decade, we have a different problem. How do we develop it faster? And I do think employment will increase pretty dramatically. Uh, at some point, it will start replacing jobs.
mhm.
Uh, Let me give you an example.
That'd be great. Yeah.
Why is all this manufacturing done in China? Because you could get $2 an hour labor. Now, with the robotic arm and real AI, $2 an hour labor is relatively easily possible in the next 5 years in the US. Now, it may take away jobs from China and transfer them to the US, but it will create lots of other jobs around that function of, say, an assembly line robot. And somebody like Vicarious AI, one of our companies, is creating assembly line robotics, um, which is a great place to develop robotics and AI. So jobs will be created. Now, what's missing in AI today? And we can get to the ethics discussion. What's missing in AI is today learning how to do a task like that is programming for programmers. So any programmer can program a KUKA robot as long as they learn the language. It takes a long time. The robot doesn't learn by itself.
Mhm,
What Vicarious is doing is say, watch a human being change from assembling an iPhone to assembling a clock a dozen times, not 12 million times, and learn from that and do the assembly. There are other people taking the approach, try this task, we'll do the end specification of what we want assembled. You figure it out. And Google has AI that's blundering about till it figures out the process. In any case, this full specification and then learning how to do it are two separate parts of the program that AI is getting much better at over time, but it will create more jobs than it destroys for the next decade, to come back to your question.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So I also actually read an interesting article recently, and you kind of covered this in your intro, but it brought up the idea of AI and ML not as replacements, which is what a lot of people are fearing, but as assistants instead, which is what you kind of touched on when you talked about Tab 9. What do you think about the notion of AI/ML as an assistant versus a replacement?
I think that's the right way to go initially. Uh, so mm, take designing a primary care physician AI.
Hmm.
You wouldn't want to do it where it starts practicing right away. It's not going to be good enough.
Hmm.
And one of the characteristics of almost all AI systems is they learn. They learn slowly. A human being might take 25 years to learn from baby stage to a professional physician, or 30 years. Um, and the AI learns, say, over 5, 7 years.
Mhm.
And people expect results too soon. Until we get results, you want guardrails. And so,
Mhm.
an AI assistant for our primary care physician, something my son's company is doing, is very, very valuable. In
Mhm.
fact, they have a chat based interface with the patients, and there's an AI. There's Indian doctors in India that are lower cost, and then physicians who are licensed to practice and prescribe, diagnose, and prescribe. And that loop is virtuous. And you can imagine learning over 5 years. But if you ask me whether we'll need the assistant model by 2040, the chances are pretty low,
Mhm.
because we will exceed the capability of the human being. Now, the human being still will be needed, especially in medicine, for the
Yes.
human elements of care. And they can pay more attention to each patient. Today, you go to the doctor, you on average get 4 minutes or 5 minutes. I think that's the statistic for a typical primary care visit. Um, you'll get a lot more time because the AI can do a lot of the other work. How we
Yes.
choose to use AI uh, will depend on personal preference, but it will be a choice we have.
Yeah. I completely agree with you. Especially I
But for the
think.
next
Mhm.
decade, I love this AI assistant model.
Yes. Yeah, I think there are some things that AI can capitalize on, but other things, you're right with the missing the human element of care for physicians. I think is a big thing that we won't be able to replace, maybe partially because of AI limitations. Other than that, it's also just like personal feelings about like having an AI as your doctor.
But look, we are all human beings, right?
Yes.
If I'm meeting somebody and I get a little impatient, it shows up in my voice without me realizing it. An AI sitting in my Apple Watch could nudge me and say, "Hey, calm down," right?
Yeah.
Or you're losing your partner in the communication. So there is lots of roles like that. Could
Mhm.
look at your facial expressions, your voice tone, suggest different language while you're in a conversation with somebody or a negotiation or whatever it is.
Mhm. Yeah, that is true. So actually, there was something else I want to talk about is something that's been more and more in the spotlight recently is how, companies use our data. So what do you say to the collection of data as a basic premise slash input for AI? And how do you see the ethics around this collection of data evolving in the next few years?
So I look, I think these are social choices
Hmm.
society has to make. The Europeans have gone uh, to restrictions on data. I'm not a huge fan of GDPR restrictions. I think a very different dimension has to happen. I personally believe users should own their own data and have the ability to revoke the use of that data, whether it's for advertising or in medicine for drug discovery. We had a very interesting genomics company just got sold. They'd sequence your genome for essentially free, uh, and they would use it to sell to pharma companies. But the data was in the blockchains, and so the user, the patient had to authorize each sale. They could
Oh.
authorize categories of use. They could authorize individual sale cases. It was the patient's choice, and they could revoke it at any time. And so that was a really good model. And
Hmm.
because it was in the blockchain, uh, even the company couldn't access it without your permission. which is a great advantage of a decentralized trust system like the blockchain.
Yes.
You didn't have to trust the company to not misuse your data. It just wasn't available to you. And I
Mhm.
think models like that are emerging. I do think users should own their data, and but most users will want to participate most of the time, other than certain special cases, to get the benefits of the data pooling. I
Mhm.
personally believe users who pool their data, make it available, should get the benefits, and users who opt out of data usage should not get the benefits of algorithms that use that data. While we are talking about this, uh, let me mention something else that's gnawing at the back of my head.
Mhm.
I
Go
think
ahead.
this whole data argument for AI systems may actually go away.
Really?
So there's a class of AI
Mhm.
starting from an area of programming called probabilistic programming
Mhm.
that is starting to say humans don't need 12 million examples of a cat to recognize a cat, that there are non data intensive techniques for learning systems. Jeff Tenenbaum at MIT, some of his work is probably the best work in this area,
Mhm.
that you combine various other things like models of knowledge that don't depend on massive amounts of data. Now, some things like image, you may still need lots of data, others you may not.
Mhm.
So I have this gnawing suspicion that data argument in 10 years will become moot because
Oh.
you won't need data to do AI systems.
I think it would be really interesting to see where it goes in 10 years. I have a feeling that you may be right as well, just knowing how things are going right now in the ML industry. So right now, I would like to pivot to business. So, you have been a prolific founder and investor, and we'd be curious to hear your core thesis and how has that shaped the way you view tech companies, investments, and entrepreneurs that you like to work with?
Um, so let me add one more thought on the ethics side
Yes.
that I think is pretty important to recognize, but is generally not recognized.
Hmm.
The most common thing we hear about is bias in AI systems, and racial bias, gender bias, all kinds of biases.
Hmm.
I would say the following. Uh, I would ask the question, where did the bias come from? And it came from the humans who generated that data.
Hmm.
So humans are fundamentally biased. And I think what AI systems have done is surface this bias. That these systems, if we learn from the data that humans have generated, we will incorporate the bias that humans
Yes.
had. What I find encouraging about that is for the first time in the history of mankind, we've surfaced biases and proven biases, right?
Hmm.
And so I'm not discouraged by the biases in AI systems. I'm encouraged that we, for the first time, said if an interviewer goes to a campus for interviewing candidates, they are bringing their biases along, and this gets embedded in this AI system. Now that we know it exists and we can quantify it, now we can start to fix it. And so we debias the data or unbias the data. And I think that's pretty important to recognize around the lines of ethics of AI systems.
Hmm.
Let me go back to your next question. Could you repeat that?
Of course. So, you've been a prolific founder and an investor, and we'd love to hear your core thesis and how that thesis has shaped the way that you view tech companies, investments, and entrepreneurs that you like to work with.
You know, so there's multiple things that one can do as an investor.
Mhm.
There's good investing, and lots of people do that much better than I do. Uh, they run spreadsheets, they can calculate IRRs, they can make intelligent investments with low chance of failure, high probability of success, that kind of thing. I've taken a very different view. I
Mhm,
work on the things that are hugely disruptive, fairly bold, very early before the boldness is clear, and that have a large impact on society. That's sort of my shtick.
mhm,
I like to say my willingness to fail gives me the ability to succeed. And only my willingness to fail gives me the ability to succeed. And I think people limit themselves well below their capability because they're afraid of failing.
mhm,
There's also sort of this investment paradigm of reducing risk. But I always say people reduce risk investments to the points where the probability of failure is low, but the consequences of success are inconsequential. I don't mind a higher probability of failure as long as the consequences of success are consequential,
mhm,
which is what lets me take large technical risks uh, in undefined areas. In DevOps, before DevOps was a term, in developer CRM, before developer CRM is a thing, in Fusion, in Impossible Foods, before it was kosher to talk about plant proteins as the primary protein source in the world. I could go on and on.
mhm,
Um, but today, fusion is considered crazy. 3D printing buildings, which we are doing, is considered crazy. Designing a new public transit system, which we are doing, is crazy. Obviously, hamburgers were always crazy for the venture business, but they're now become fashionable. But whether you're talking about OpenAI and artificial general intelligence or fusion or 3D printing buildings, you want to stretch yourself, allow yourself to fail so that you can have consequential successes.
mhm. Yeah, that's fantastic. I think you may have already answered my next question, but I'm sure there's no magic formula, but what are some high level things that you've noticed has worked with making decisions when it comes to investments?
You look, the most important decision you make is always the people you're betting on, and the
Mhm,
second most important is the space. So I'd sort of say look for a rich space and a great entrepreneur.
mhm,
The rest sort of takes care of itself. One of my favorite sayings, whether it's a company or a space, is the team you build is the company you build, not the business plan you make.
mhm,
Because if you hire a great team, they figure out where to go as long as the space is rich. So the space has to be right and the team has to be great. And very often, I'll help a team assemble the, the rest of the team.
mhm.
And I find that's the most impactful way I can affect a team.
That's some fantastic insight. Now I would jump straight to the point though. What has been the most valuable lesson that you've learned in your career?
Um, I'd sort of say most people are limited not by what they can do, but what they think they can do. So they self imposed limits. That combined by being willing to take risk and fail in ways that doesn't kill you but makes you stronger,
Mhm,
uh, is, I think, what makes life much more interesting and fun. The other thing is, if you're working on something you're passionate about, you're going to be much more effective. You'll stick with it much longer, and persistence is really, really important. You keep at things till you figure it out. So those are some of the lessons that are disproportionately more important than they recognize.
mhm. Yeah. So at DevRev, we have this belief that the youth are truly the force that will drive companies forward. Um, but as a member of the youth, I sometimes have felt a bit lost. So how can someone who is just starting their career like me make the most of their opportunities?
Well, the first thing I'd say is people say this, but I think you can be youthful at any age.
That is
Uh,
true.
at age 66, I plan on the next 20 years take increasingly more risks in more variable areas, all driven by what I know, which is technology driven innovation and disruption. Um, what is generally true is the older people get, the more experience they get, the more bias they get in how things work, and they're not as open minded.
Mhm,
I've seen people at all ages being very open minded, so it's not an age related thing.
mhm,
It's uh, it's an attitude and mindset related thing. So I'd recommend everybody in your audience read a book called The Growth Mindset by Carol Dweck.
mhm,
It says you can always be open minded and try things. So uh, I would say to you, because I often get asked about, I feel lost and feel uncertain. Most innovation happens at the edges with high ambiguity. If you imagine the core of society, it's pretty solidified. GE has been GE and Siemens has been Siemens very much for the last 50 years that I've seen them.
mhm,
Um, so ambiguity is okay. In fact, ambiguity is where there's new discoveries to be made. Because if it was clear what to work on, lots of people would have done it. Let me give you another hopeful sign.
mhm,
In the last 40 years that I've followed innovation, I haven't found one example of a large innovation, and there may be some exceptions in especially drug discovery or some very specialty areas, but in most large changes in society, I couldn't find an example in 40 years where change was driven by somebody who knew the area they were changing. Jeff Bezos knew nothing about retail. It didn't come from Walmart or Target. Elon Musk didn't know anything about cars. Waymo didn't know anything about driverless cars. Um, Airbnb didn't know anything about hotels.
mhm,
Can you imagine anybody from Hilton creating an Airbnb?
mm-mm,
Uber didn't know car rental. Avis, Hertz, you pick your or taxi service. Um, Biotechnology was started by people who didn't know pharmaceuticals. So as I looked across the spectrum, almost all in innovation happened because somebody chose to start with first principles and say, why isn't things or why aren't things done this way, as opposed to bring that experience and hence those biases into the new paradigm. I would say the following: experience is a bias, which is good when you're extrapolating the past, but not a real disadvantage when you're inventing the future, a new kind of future, a
mhm.
radically different future.
I think that's really great advice and definitely does give me a lot of hope. So when DevRev first launched in July, there was like an article written about us that I saw that referenced unicorns. For those that are unfamiliar with the term, it's just a privately held company that's valued at over $1 billion. I'd love to know, how does a startup get on the road to being a unicorn?
I would say being a unicorn isn't what's important. I
Mhm,
think those are the wrong things to focus on. I would say focus on how you're creating value. So I hate this focus. It's great for the press. But to be honest, all the press is trying to generate stories that'll get attention. They're vying for your attention.
mhm,
So their job is to generate attention, not to generate value. Your job and DevRep's job is to create value for somebody. its customers and make them much better, much more productive, uh, do things they can't do before. So, one, I'm not a big fan on focusing on valuation.
Mhm.
I think I'm a fan of what is the area you innovating in? Does it have 10 years of innovation? There are areas where you have an innovation and it's one and done. Um, and then areas where you iteratively refine your product over a decade or more to build something really valuable. This is exactly what GitLab has done in our space of software tools
Mhm.
um, over a decade. And the product looks nothing like it did. You know, Square 10 years ago when we invested was a hardware dongle, just this $10 thing that plugged into your iPhone audio jack.
Mhm.
Today, it's more valuable or the same value as American Express. Through a series of iterative refinements and expansion of the vision, because both DevRev, GitLab, and even Square are operating in rich spaces. Same thing with Stripe when we invested. It was just a code insert into, it was literally a small script. It's become a massive behemoth now. Um, so I think these models are iterative and eventually to be valuable, they end up being exponential in their utility to somebody.
Mhm.
And I think that should be our goal.
Yeah, that's great advice. The value will come. I see. I think is what you're saying. If you create the value yourself. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. So, I'd love to talk to you a little bit more about tech. You've been in the industry both as a participant and as an investor for a long time now. And how has the trajectory of tech changed? And how has this change been driven by AI and ML?
Well, so the first thing I'd say is 15, 20 years ago, tech was about tech. That means tech applied to enterprise software, internet, a few areas like that. It wasn't about housing or hamburgers
Mhm.
or construction or space. You know, the power of technology has now enabled it to enter all parts of society, not just the tech parts of society. So, technology was a tool for technology spaces,
Mhm.
and now it's a tool for everything from insurance to fintech to currency, as in blockchain, to uh, 3D printed construct housing, uh, fusion reactors. It's about everything. And
Mhm.
that's very encouraging. So the scope for tech has dramatically expanded, which for us techies is really exciting.
Yes. Yes,
This is
it
what keeps
definitely. Mhm.
me going and saying, hey, at age 66, I easily see a path of so many fun things to work on and hard things.
Mhm.
Hard, fun, bold, early, impactful things to work on the next 20 years, health permitting.
Yeah, that's fantastic. You have the spirit of a 22-year-old.
I feel
Uh,
like I'm 22. I feel like a kid in a candy shop.
so, I've only been working as a developer for a couple of months, so I am curious. Have you noticed any striking differences between the way developers do things today and the way developers did things like 10, 15 years ago?
Well, I think there's a lot more power in the hands of the developer today. They can
Mhm.
do a lot more. Um, and I think that enables uh, a lot more capability in a lot more spaces.
Mhm.
There's also a lot more spaces open for uh, developers to operate in. So, for example, the creator economy, is a whole new thing. You didn't think it needed software tools, but how do you create software tools for creators? There's 40 million of them around now. That's a big
Mhm.
enough community. I mentioned 100 million programmers with Excel. Um, it's there's tools needed for that, and that's a powerful new market. Um, the other thing that's different for developers is the rate of change is much higher. So life is more interesting because there's always something new. Yeah, it used to be languages came along every 5 or 10 years. Uh, Tools came along every 5 or 10 years. Uh, Now it's constantly changing. And so keeping up is both a chore, a task, and new learning.
Mhm.
So, and so new learning, new capability, new spaces to operate in. What more could you ask for?
Mm. I yeah.
And frankly, this is the space I want to go back to your AI question.
Mhm.
Technology hasn't mostly been driven by AI so far.
Mhm.
But if I look at the next decade or two, if you're just starting out, in the next 10 years or 15 years, AI will change the programmer's life. Um, and there's many, many aspects. There's AI as we know it, which is deep learning mostly today. I think other forms of AI will become important. Quantum computing will enable a whole new world of both AI and programming,
Mhm.
something we haven't thought about. Um, and then there's this esoteric field we've started to do some things in called probabilistic programming. I'm sorry, um, program synthesis, which is a whole new space where you synthesize functions. There was the old function in order in Excel where you say you had to change a column and change the comma to a space or something like that from one column to another.
Mhm.
You did it two or three times, it would suggest the formula for it.
Yeah.
That was actually the first example of program synthesis, where you specify a problem and the software then takes it over. And so both specifying and DevRev is at this interface between specifying a problem. When you say developer CRM, uh, you're talking to your customers about specifying the problem completely and iteratively,
Mhm.
and then coding it. The coding part will become very much AI driven, I think, once you have a full specification. AI may even help you complete the specification and ask you, you said, sort these numbers, increase by increasing order. Do numerics come first or last?
Mhm.
It's a choice. Um, so things like that will become part of developer CRM, the specification problem. My favorite, if you take Oracle's old Oracle systems, Oracle SQL is a fully specified language. AI could translate it into Postgres
Mhm.
and not need and test the problem. So testing is another really, really
Yes.
interesting area in software where AI will play a very, very large role that people are underestimating today.
Mhm.
Um, so um, you could translate Oracle, which, a company like Amazon or Salesforce spent billion dollars or more trying to translate from Oracle databases to Postgres or something new. Um, those are interesting problems because they're relatively fully specified. Um, and those kinds of fully specified problems will be where AI will play a large role first.
Mhm.
But of course, there's this new movement called no code. But it's really about iterative space in narrow domains. It's a version of Excel. In other domains, it's a iterative specification by the customer,
Mhm.
and then refinement by a system. So lots of axes of innovation going on here. The AI, the program synthesis, forms of iterative specification are all very, very interesting in software development, and software itself is eating the world. And of course, software 2.0, I'd be amiss if I didn't mention it. If people haven't seen Andrej Karpathy's blog on software 2.0, I highly recommend it, where the software will do the coding and the data will be the input and the goals of the program.
Yeah, I think that's. I definitely agree with you. I think at least from I grew up with these technologies generally, and it's really great to like hear insight from someone who's been around a bit longer, and hear like how it's been driven by like AI and ML, and how looking into the future it can be driven by AI and ML. So I think we have time for one more question, and I throughout this whole talk you have been incredibly knowledgeable on what's been going on, like what's current and things like that, and I like I said earlier, there's always new things coming out of the tech industry. Like, back then it was like every 5, 10 years, something big comes out. Now it's like every 5, 10 days, it seems. And it can get a little overwhelming. So, how do you keep up with these new technologies?
You know, read a lot, read extensively. I have stacks and stacks of things to read every weekend. uh, there's no magic formula, but it's also okay to narrow in and not try and keep up with everything. You don't want to feel like you're drowning, just feel like you know a space well.
Mhm.
You know, so it's okay to narrow down, say, I'll try and understand. I still uh, try and read scientific papers on antibodies and on AI. It's a rare weekend. I'm not at least reading the abstracts of papers across four entirely different domains. Uh, that'd be a rare weekend. But it's okay to focus on narrower areas and feel comfortable. Don't feel you're drowning. Let me make one other comment that I
Yeah.
think is a social comment. We started with ethics. We are in a very privileged world. We have the background to do what we do and to pick up a new area, whether it's AI or program synthesis or antibody discovery. But there are people who can't participate in that, and we can't leave them behind.
Mhm.
So let's end on that note. We have to be extra considerate of people being left behind.
Yes. Yeah, I that's a fantastic note to end on. Thank you so much, Manoj, for your time and insight. We really appreciate you joining us here today. I definitely learned a lot, and I'm positive others have as well.
Great. Well, good luck to Devrav, and I'm really excited to be part of the journey.